Magick.me is the world's greatest school for magic, meditation, and mysticism. You can learn everything there, from chaos magic to hermeticism to meditation to how to supercharge your finances and take absolute control of your destiny. In short, you get all of the tools you need to turn chaos into beautiful, scintillating order and master your life. It's incredible. You've probably heard me talk about it on the show quite a lot. But check it out. It's growing fast. And I just want to say, if you're confused about where to start, because I have so many courses there, the Adept Initiative is the place to go. The Adept Initiative is the flagship course on Magick.me, and it contains everything you need to know to master the most profound ancient techniques of changing your consciousness and the most modern and cutting-edge tools and systems for absolutely turning your life into a masterpiece. You're really going to dig it. Go check it out, and I will see you in class. It's magick.me, magick.me.
All right. So your book is Psychedelic Buddhism. Why don't you welcome to the podcast? Thank you very much for being on the podcast. You want to talk a little bit about the generally about your book, and actually, why don't you start off talking about yourself and your background, if you don't mind?
Well, I was born in Cardiff in South Wales in 1948. When I was a teenager, I was really quite left-wing and very much against nuclear weapons. And a nearby high school, when I was 15, had a week of talks and lectures by people they'd invited along for the purpose. And every day except one had some really interesting left-wing speaker. And we were allocated which day we were to go on. And I was unfortunately given, fortunately, as it turned out, but at the time I thought it was unfortunate that I'd been given the Tuesday, which had no political speakers whatsoever. I chose to attend a particular speaker because I thought, as a Buddhist, he was speaking about Buddhism. I considered him to be a foolish person of weak intellect who had been perverted by exposure to some Asiatic god cult. And I turned up with, I'm desperately trying to remember what my attitude was at the time, but it's a mere 60 years ago, so it's not that difficult. And when he spoke, I objected to almost every sentence that he made, every proposition that he came up with, I had an objection to. And then at the end of the lecture, I went up to him and said, "That was fascinating. Where can I learn more about it?" And he was shocked. He thought, he said that he thought I was completely against the subject because I brought up objections to it. Well, he should have known, because it's written in the Buddhist scriptures that this is the way you're supposed to react.
Yes.
When you first experience everything, is challenge everything you find dubious. Make them spell it out. And I told him, no, I found it, he had all the right answers. They completely satisfied me. For one thing, he said that there was no soul. We hadn't got an immortal soul. And
very difficult for Western people, I think.
Yes, and I considered this, and I thought, damn, I think you're right. And so from him, I got the address of the Buddhist Society in London at 58 Eccleston Square.
Is that, just as a tangent, is that the one that Alan Bennett started?
Yes.
Excellent.
Yes.
Interesting.
Yeah,
So fascinating connection. Yeah.
For a moment, I thought you were talking about the playwright.
Oh, yeah. No. The Bhikkhu Anandamataya.
Yes, exactly.
Yes.
Yes, there's a portrait of him in there somewhere.
Yeah, Aleister Crowley's mentor. And I'm sure you get this all the time, but I have to ask, given your interest and last name, you're not related to Aleister Crowley by any chance, are you?
No, in fact, I'm not.
Okay.
Because, he was a Crowley, and his name comes from a village in Cheshire. And it's quite a rare name. Many people came from that village. I, on the other hand, am a Crowley. And although it's spelled the same, it's an entirely different lineage. Mine is an Irish name, which was originally spelled something like Cruadhlaoich.
Interesting. Okay. Well, I had to ask. Excuse me, please.
Clears things up.
Just the Alan Bennett thing was so interesting. So you went to the Buddhist Society in London,
right? And every time I was in London, I would go along to the Buddhist Society and pick up a few free pamphlets and occasionally buy a book. And when I was 18 or 19, I think. Yeah, I think I was 18. I moved up to London, and there was a guy who was a neighbor of mine who collected antiques from jumble sales. I'm sure you have a word for jumble sales, but
garage sales. Yeah, we call them garage sales here.
Well,
that thing. Yeah.
If it's not just one person's garage, it's lots.
So, yeah, we call those swap meets.
Well, there you go.
Yeah.
And he used to go to about 3 every Saturday morning. And he would just breeze into one, go, oh, yeah, that, and then leave with it, go to the next one and say, I want that and that. And then when by lunchtime he had acquired several of these antiques, and he would come along to where I was living. He just lived 5 doors away, so he would come along and show the articles that he bought, and these were things like Mary Gregory glass, which is now very, very much sought after, not so much in those days. A sable coat, which he gave to my girlfriend. And there's one day he came by with a brass object which had 3 blades which came to a point, blunt, very blunt blades, and you wouldn't cut anything at all with them. Well, maybe blancmange, but nothing of any more substance than blancmange. So in the center of it, there was a dorje, a representation of a thunderbolt, and at the other end to the points, there were the 3 faces of a deity surmounted by a horse's head. Now, this was absolutely, I seem to have lost you just a moment. There you go.
See me now? Okay.
And these were totally baffling to me. But my neighbor said, I think it's Mexican. What do you think? And I said, well, I have no idea what it really is, what it's used for, but I'm pretty sure it's Tibetan. And he said, oh, no, I'm sure it's Mexican. And I said, wait, I've got a book that I've borrowed from the Buddhist Society, and it's got a picture of one of those. So I went up to my bedroom and brought this book down and showed it to him. And he was looking at the book, looking at the object. And he said, well, I think you're right. It is one of those in the picture. Oh, well, then you can have it then. And I objected, saying I couldn't possibly afford it. And he said, oh, no, it only cost me pennies. So you can definitely have it. And then I was stuck with this object, which was called a purva. And I took it into the Buddhist Society and I said, do you have any books on Tibetan ritual implements? Because I think this will be in it. And they said, oh, no, you've read all 3 books on Tibetan Buddhism. This was the librarian, Pat Wilkinson. She was an amazing person who had hitchhiked to Burma in the 1920s to study meditation with the Burmese monks.
Wow.
Yeah, I know. It's like
also where Ellen Bennett studied, I think.
Yes.
Ceylon,
yeah, and Ceylon, yeah. And so she said, you've read everything we've got on Tibetan Buddhism, but as it happens, there's a Tibetan Lama who has just moved into London, and he's staying at a youth hostel, a Quaker youth hostel, I should point out. And if you like, I'll give him a call. And she phoned him and arranged for me to go over there that afternoon, immediately leave there and go over to this youth hostel. And he was quite young, 12 years older than me. And he made us both a cup of tea, and we had a reasonable chat about the purva. His English wasn't very good, I have to admit. And he's still alive. I saw him just a couple of years ago, and his English hasn't improved an awful lot in the end. So eventually he taught me Tibetan. And so after that meeting, I said, well, it was really interesting. Could I see you next week? And he said, yes, of course, come along next Friday. And so for the next 7 years, I saw him all day Friday. And eventually he got a job at the British Museum, and I had to stop these Friday visits.
So you just so I'm clear, so you officially kind of started training in a Tibetan lineage this way?
Yes.
Okay. Which lineage? Which lineage was he from?
Kaju.
Okay. Interesting. So that's quite you went straight to the center of it.
Right. Not by any intention on my part. It was purely accidental. Well, if you concede that there are such things as accidents, that is
hard to believe sometimes.
Yes.
So, and then at some point you became ordained as a lama.
Well, first of all, in 1970, May the 1st, 1970, I was ordained as an upasaka, an ordained layman. And that's when I took the 5 pencil vows: not to kill, not to lie, not to steal, not to commit adultery, and not to drink alcohol. Now, this was this is the way the 5 vows are taken in Tibet. Other more modern versions of Buddhism substitute alcohol for with drugs.
Yeah,
and that's not what the 5th precept states in its original form. When I had been studying Buddhism for some time, by the way, I also studied Sanskrit and Mandarin Chinese, all of which I believe helped my understanding of the lineage. And the more I got into Buddhism, the more I realized that psychedelic drugs were used in the Vajrayāna. They were generally considered a form of Amrita. With Amrita, it means deathlessness. Mri means to die or death. A means not. And ta is roughly equivalent to our suffix ness. So it's not die-ness is what Amrita means. But it's a liquid. It's a potion which is consumed before initiations and for Ghana chakras, which is the monthly meeting you have with other people who've done the same initiations as you. I should tell you a little story I heard in Trinity County, in fact. There is a large Buddhist establishment in Trinity County, which is set up like a Tibetan center. And it has stupas and a big statue of Padmasambhava. And so it was created by a Tibetan called Chaktud Rinpoche. And Chaktud created this and had used a lot of donations to help build this place. And then when it was all finished, he said, fantastic, I'm going to Brazil now and see if I can do it there. Okay. Which outraged a lot of the people who'd been supplying the funds for this place. Eventually, he did build a place in Brazil, and he was quite old actually, and he eventually died. And when he did, the money people in California ousted the Lama he put in his place, which he was an American, not a Tibetan, but he was a close disciple of Chaktud Rinpoche. And so when he was going to leave the center, he asked all the inhabitants of the center to come and eat up his larder, drink all of his wine, and dispose of all of the food and drink. Well, I was told this story by someone who was there at the time. And he says that, unfortunately, he was an alcoholic.
Okay.
And the amount of wine they had was enough to whet his appetite, and he decided that he needed more wine, or at least more alcohol. And he went around the kitchen, opening cupboards, looking in drawers, until he found a medicine bottle. And it was full of liquid. He uncorked it and sniffed it, and sure enough, it smelled of alcohol. So he downed the lot. He drank it all. It was, in fact, a homemade brew of Amrita, and it was prepared for initiations.
What was the active ingredient?
We don't know.
Okay, acid or something.
Well, it was obviously herbs which are available in Tibet. And
well, that's what I was going to ask you. I mean, when we talk about psychedelic use in Tibet, I mean, I have so many questions about that. But the first one is what psychedelic were they taking?
well, if we read I'll just finish this story first.
Yes.
He tripped for 5 days. He was out of his brains, and he saw Dakinis, Buddhas, Bodhisattvas, and they were all imparting teachings to him. And
did he write them down? I hope.
No, he didn't, because he was told by the Lama, the one who was leaving the place. He was told that these were. He was told that he didn't have sufficient background to understand what was being told to him. And so he was told basically to disregard these dakinis and so on. So yes, so to get back to your statement about the psychedelics available in Tibet. Well, it seems that if we look at the life of Milarepa,
okay,
Milarepa, Tibet's greatest yogin, he studied with Marpa Lotsawa, the translator, and he was actually engaged in a retreat. He was doing his 3-year retreat, and he'd only been in retreat for a few months, 2 months, I think it was, when Dabmema, Marpa's wife, came knocking on his door and said, "You have to come out of retreat now. Marpa wants to see you." And first of all, he said, "I don't believe it. It's another one of his tricks." And I mean, having been in retreat with the Lama on the premises myself, I think this is quite a reasonable supposition on his part that it could easily have been a trick.
So a trick to get him to break his meditation.
Yes.
Okay.
A test.
Yeah.
Will he come out? And anyway, she tried several times, and she said, "No." Marpa says, "This is a real thing. He's got hold of some Amrita from India." So this must have been a form of Amrita which was available in India, which is most likely, I think, mushrooms.
Mm-hmm.
Probably psilocybe cubensis.
Well, there's also, I having been to India and seen gigantic fields of marijuana growing everywhere, and having had banglasis that were profoundly psychedelic, maybe they had a hold of that too.
Well, yes, but that does have its own name in Tibet.
Oh, okay.
It's it has several names, in fact, and one the most amusing of them is laughter medicine. Or mirth medicine, as a friend of mine suggested. So I think that was a standard part of the Tibetan pharmacopoeia. Tibetan doctors had cannabis on hand. They would give it to depressed patients and so on. So this had to have come from India, as Marpa was waiting for this and was delighted that it arrived. And we have within the Kaju lineage, we have a secret teaching about Milarepa. And it says that when Marpa offered him the skull cup of Amrita, he was supposed to take a sip, but instead, not knowing any better, he drank the whole thing. And he was, it is said that the Dakini is present at the initiation, which was into Chakra Samvara, by the way, who I identify as a mushroom deity. It's in my book, Secret Drugs of Buddhism. But anyway, he was given the name Khepa Dorje by the Dakinis who attended the initiation. Khepa Dorje means laughing Vajra. And so he must have, he up until this point, Milarepa was tormented by the thought that he had actually killed people during his rituals. And as he directed some of his magical spells towards his former house, which had been usurped by rapacious uncle. And it said that he created a gigantic scorpion who pulled down all the pillars, the supporting pillars of the house, and the house collapsed on everyone. And he was quite upset by the fact that he had done this, and went to Marpa for some kind of expiation of his guilt. It's unlikely that there was a giant scorpion, but it's quite likely that there was an earthquake, as there are tales of earthquakes in that region at that time. So anyway, the Milarepa was one of the first to have the real Amrita. Later on in his life story, we hear that a monk called Gampopa, that is a man from the Gampo Valley, that's what it means. He went looking for Milarepa and found him in his mountain yoga camp, and gave Milarepa a package of tea that he brought specially as a gift for him. And Milarepa was just about to perform an initiation for those assembled, and it was initiation into to a form of Vajrayogini. And it was a Vajrayogini whose the name means vermilion colored. She was the color of this ore of mercury, which is bright red. Anyway, Milarepa said, "Wonderful, thank you. It's great. We've got something to share among all the yogins here. We'll make tea." And he boiled water and poured it into a large teapot with the tea. And when it was brewing, he urinated into the tea, and it tasted delicious as a result. It's not often you know somebody pisses into your tea and you think it tastes great, but these guys did, and And as a result, Gampopa said that this was the most significant initiation he'd had. He'd had various initiations before this, but had never really felt it.
Interesting. Would this have been with the person who peed in his tea? Is that somebody who's taken quite a lot of mushrooms first, in the same way that, you know, in Northern Europe they drink the reindeer
yes,
piss after they eat the amanita.
Well, that's actually doubtful.
Okay.
Whether they do actually drink the reindeer's piss, because they're not going to run around following the herd until somebody takes a leak and they put a jug underneath it. No, that's the reindeer herders, like the Lap and the Siberian tribes who herd reindeer, they do take Amanita muscaria. But there's been a lot of fantasy based on these.
Interesting. There was an art installation in New York a few years ago where they locked everyone in an art gallery overnight with a reindeer and Amanita muscaria, had the reindeer eat the mushroom, and then all the highest sophisticated New York art people drank the reindeer piss and tripped, apparently. So
yep.
Maybe they were just fooling themselves.
I know people who use Amanita muscaria, and they say it is essential to drink the urine, to drink your own urine, in fact. And that's because there is a decarboxylation of ibotenic acid, which occurs in the liver, and it turns the slightly psychoactive, rather more poisonous ibotenic acid, and it takes that and converts it to muscimol. And so there is more muscimol, which is the hallucinogenic substance. There's more in the urine of somebody who has eaten it than is actually present in the mushroom.
Got it.
So it is essential, I'm told, to drink your own urine. And I'm also told that it tastes delicious, just like the people said after they drank the tea that Milarepa had peed in.
Okay. So this is super. So it sounds like, if I'm correct, if I'm hearing you correctly, it sounds like you spent a lot of time drawing out the psychedelic tradition in Tibetan, or maybe even Buddhism beyond Tibetan Buddhism. Did it sound like maybe had been kept a little on the sidelines or not talked about?
It is, well, in the 1970s, I was having a chat with my guru, my Lama, and he said, they tell me that you take psychedelics. Is this true? And I said, yes. And he said, good. And then talked about other things. He didn't elaborate on that at all. He just said, good.
Okay.
Now, there are at the moment, there are lamas who are quite open about their psychedelic use, like Dzongsa Khyentse Rinpoche, and a Bhutanese lama who is a grandson of Dilgo Khyentse. He is known to take ayahuasca. And he has done it at Ghana chakra ceremonies he's conducted in Brazil. And he, you can see him on YouTube. He has several videos on YouTube, one of which is in Mexico. It's filmed in Mexico. And about an hour into the talk, he says, I took some mescaline, some peyote ether, some peyote, about an hour ago, but I'm not feeling it yet. But obviously, he hadn't done it before because the active principle in peyote, mescaline, takes 2 hours to come on. It's there are several psychedelics which take a couple of hours to manifest, but I was curious to know what actually happened to him after another hour, but he finished the talk before then. Now. Now, Chögyam Trungpa Rinpoche
Yes.
Was active in Britain before he went to the United States. And he was actually my first exposure to Tibetan teachers. My own teacher actually grew up with Trungpa. They were in the same monastery in eastern Tibet, in Kham. And so I was at the Buddhist Society and witnessed Trungpa Rinpoche telling middle-aged, middle-class women with blue hair, you should really try LSD.
That's amazing.
At that time, LSD was legal in Britain. And but then at the same time as I witnessed this, I met somebody, a hippie, who lived in the same house as Trungpa. And he was telling me how they all used to do LSD together. And Trungpa was very critical of the others, saying they didn't take it seriously enough. Huh. And he said that in Tibet, they had something called Dutsi Rilbu, which is, Dutsi is Tibetan for Amrita, and Rilbu is pill. So these are Amrita pills. Now, they needn't have been mushrooms. Certainly, the mushrooms were used as Amrita in the early stages of the Vajrayāna. But by the 10th century, they were using a concoction of 5 plants. And these plants were known by code names. They were cow, dog, elephant, I can't remember what the 4th one is. And the 5th one is man, human. So as they were using several substances, we had to work out what these meant. It seems that cow meant psilocybe cubensis. There are lots of clues to this.
Maybe because it grows on cow dung.
Yes, that's exactly why it's associated with the cow. And there is a text, a medieval text from Tibet that says, if you can't get cow, peacock is a good substitute. Now, it sounds weird that if you can't get this large mammal, you can use this bird instead. But that's not what it meant. They were talking about 2 mushrooms. There is a folktale in in India, which is concerned with the churning of the ocean. I don't know if you know this myth.
Yes, I do.
And in the myth, Shiva drinks the hala hala poison, and the god Vishnu clamps his hand around Shiva's throat, the bottom of his throat, to say, don't you dare swallow it. Oh, no, it's his wife, Parvati, who does that. Vishnu slaps his hand on his mouth and says, don't spit it out either. So that's why Shiva's throat is blue, because it's been...
that part, I'd heard this story, but that part I didn't realize that his wife was strangling him, and that's why it was blue. I just heard that he transmuted the poison and that his throat then turned blue.
Right.
Interesting. Interesting. Okay.
But if you look at the Hindu texts, you'll see that Shiva is interchangeable with the mushroom. And so the mushroom has a blue throat, in that the stem is tinted with the psilocin oxide, which is dark blue. And so I dwell on this subject in my first book, which was Secret Drugs of Buddhism, which if anybody is really interested, they could go and check it out. But in Tibet, we had people like Khepo Dorje, who was a student of Gampopa. And he founded a monastery, he founded a subsect of the Kaju called the Drukpa Kaju, which means the dragon Kaju. And he founded it because he was in the southeast corner of Tibet, an area known in Tibetan as Monyu. And he found a hillside that was covered in a particular plant, which I've not been able to identify botanically. But anyway, he ate the roots of this plant, and he saw 9 dragons cavorting in the sky. And as a result, he founded this branch of the Kaju called the dragon Kaju, the Drukpa Kaju. There are very many stories about the use of psychoactive drugs in Tibetan, but unfortunately, very few have been translated. And so it's possible to have a country of Tibetan Buddhists who know nothing about psychoactive.
Right. Yeah, that's. I think that's true of maybe lots of traditions. I think it would be really helpful in that light. I think it would be very helpful, particularly for audience members who may not know anything about Tibetan Buddhism or just the basics, to kind of just define, and ideally in completely straight, non-mystical language as much as possible, for rational headed people, to explain what the training is, what the point is, what one is trying to do, and then why psychedelics would possibly be helpful with that.
Of course, they're not the entirety of the teachings. It is expected that, first of all, the earliest teachings of anybody in a Buddhist tradition is that you take the earliest teachings of Buddhism, Hinayana, Buddhism, it's called by the Mahayana. Mahayana means the great vehicle. And they call this other form, this earlier form, Hinayana, meaning the lesser vehicle. It doesn't call itself the Hinayana, it calls itself Buddhist. And that's about all. Now, in this vehicle, you learn to meditate. You learn the two basic forms of meditation, which are tranquility or shamatha meditation and insight or vipassana. Now, after a while, after a couple of years maybe of practicing the Hinayana path, you're introduced to the Mahayana, and then you take the Bodhisattva vow, which says that from this point on, your entire focus of your practice and of your life really is for the betterment of other people. And so you have a ceremony in which you say an elaborate form of the Bodhisattva vow, that you will put other people first at every point in your life. And then every day following that, you recite an abbreviated form of the Bodhisattva vow. Bodhisattva, by the way, is a Sanskrit word meaning enlightened person. And after some years of practicing the Bodhisattva path, you may or may not be offered another practice, which is called Vajrayāna, which is the thunderbolt vehicle. Now, you have to perform certain practices before you are allowed to partake of the Vajrayana rituals and so on. And these preliminary practices are reciting the 100-syllable mantra 100,000 times, visualizing and creating with a plate of copper and piles of rice. You create the mandala of the world, and you do that 100,000 times. There's also other processes which you do 100,000 times. In the Nyingma, the Nyingma tradition, they have 5 portions of their preliminary practices, and you have to do all 5 100,000 times. So this is just to ensure the sincerity of the applicant. Once they've done that, they are then eligible for the Vajrayana Empowerment. Now, in the West, it is not usually considered essential that the person has completed their preliminary practices. Just about anybody can march into an empowerment. And I've only been to one empowerment where they've said, well, the next bit is secret, but we can't tell you because there are some people who've not done their requirements. They've not done their preliminary practices, and so we're going to have to leave that part out. And I was appalled that these people didn't take the hint and get out of there, so we can have the full teaching. But anyway, the empowerments have three essentials, which have to be, all three have to be present, or it's not an empowerment. And these are the detailed visualization of the deity, the mantra of the deity, and Amrita. The Amrita is essential to an empowerment. And if you don't have it, then it's just considered a blessing. It's not a real empowerment.
Okay. Interesting. That's invalidating some of the ones I've been to. But so be it. So be it.
So,
but then I've surreptitiously partaken in other such before going into other such activities. So it makes me feel better about those.
Absolutely, you should. If they're leaving it out, you should fill it in. And yes, there are many stories of Amrita and its effects. I don't know if you know of the great 14th century philosopher called Longchenpa.
Yes.
Do you know about his first Ghana chakra?
I don't, and maybe we should say, and I don't necessarily know all the details about him either. So maybe let's say who he was.
He was a polymath, a person who basically could do anything he turned his hand to. And he wrote 7 very influential books on Dzogchen, which is a very advanced philosophy. When he was a very young Lama, he performed the Ghana chakra for the first time. And obviously, as it was his first time, he didn't know exactly how much Amrita to give everybody. But in this Ghana chakra, everybody was so high that they all manifested as deities. And there were monks and laymen and nuns and lay women at this Ghana chakra, and the women, even the lay women who were there, manifested as dakinis and gave teachings as the dakinis. The men manifested as Buddhas and so on, and he wrote it down just like completely straight-faced, as though they had really become dakinis and so on. So it's really, really fascinating to read in his life story of that episode.
I'm curious. I don't want to interrupt the story, but I'm really curious about your opinion on something, which is that I have often suspected that, particularly with Eastern texts, that seem to be magical and describing things like turning into a tiger or levitating and things like this, that a lot of times what they're really talking about is states of consciousness experience through doing practices or potentially psychedelics. And I'm curious what you think of that.
Oh, I think that is, sure, there are some stories which are just fanciful and say that somebody turned into a tiger and expected to be believed. But there are certainly a great number of stories, like, for instance, Milarepa, where he and a student were caught in a hailstorm, and Milarepa found a shell on the ground, and he hid inside it to shield himself from the hailstones. And it says in the life of Milarepa that he didn't shrink and the shell didn't get any bigger, but still he was able to get inside it. So that sounds like an Amanita muscaria experience where size is very malleable.
Interesting.
So, yeah.
And so Vajrayana, I think probably by design is always a little bit, unclear and obscure. And
absolutely.
So would it be fair to say that it's kind of when the magical and perhaps psychedelic and kind of tantric teachings start to roll out?
Well, in the Vajrayana, there are actually 7 levels of secrecy. If you go to an empowerment, you may be granted access to the first of the 7 levels. It really requires that you are a devoted student of a teacher who gives you the empowerment and says, and by the way, this means A and B and C and so on. So I think the final level in all of these is, and this is the drug which which will give you access to this deity.
You think that's the final level?
It probably is. I can't think of anything beyond that.
Interesting. Okay, so if I'm right about that, then Vajrayana is more of a direct hands-on experience, shall we say?
Oh, absolutely. Yes. Yeah. Yes.
And it sounds very much like Western, occult societies or initiatory societies.
If I knew anything about Western initiatory societies, I'd probably agree with you.
Okay, just with grades and levels and that type of thing.
Yeah. I know that Aleister Crowley used various substances in his pursuit of enlightenment.
Yeah, that he was pretty open about, particularly mescaline and later on ether, in addition to cocaine and heroin. But cocaine and heroin he used to alleviate asthma symptoms.
So, right. And unfortunately got hooked on it.
Yeah.
But he was initially given heroin as a palliative for his asthma.
Interesting. So what is the there's a really interesting writer that I like called David Chapman, who writes a lot about Buddhism, and he's initiated into, I can't remember the name of the lineage, but it's a tantric Buddhist lineage in California. It's fairly famous. I think Aro, something like that, Aro.
Oh yes. I do know something about the Aro lineage in Wales.
Okay, they seem pretty out there, but I am not a Vajrayana Buddhist, so I'm I suppose something of a fellow traveler, but I don't necessarily even consider myself a Buddhist. But he has an interesting phrase that I like a lot called consensus Buddhism, which he uses to refer to as kind of like the cleaned up, sanitized version of Buddhism for the media and for most Western people. So I was in that light. I'm kind of curious: is the use of psychedelics and that type of thing? It sounds like what you're saying is it's actually pretty widespread, but presumably that's kind of kept a little bit quiet by the big figures in Buddhism.
I believe it is, and I've never seen it spelled out anything like I've done in my books. And in my first book, I describe how I believe psychedelics were used in Tibet. And in the most recent book, it's how you can use psychedelics in Buddhist practice, regardless of what they did in Tibet. This is
so you spell out recipes.
Oh, absolutely.
Okay. What would an example be? And if you would be kind enough to share some of perhaps the more out there psychedelic experiences you've had following this type of thing, that would be lovely.
Well, in 1970, I was ordained, as I said, on May the 1st, into Buddhism as an upasaka. A few months later, I was with friends in a place in the countryside of Buckinghamshire, and we had intended to get quite high on hashish tincture, which was available on the National Health at the time. It was before they had made hashish tincture illegal. They'd overlooked it in the 1930s, and few people knew. And so if you got it on the National Health, it cost you I would say less than a dime. It was 5 pence for a pint of this stuff. And I reckon there was something like 76 or 78 doses in that pint. And so we had acquired a bottle of this, and we're going to have an evening of listening to music, classical music, actually, by one of my friends was a hi-fi geek, and I had been given a third of a tab of Orange Sunshine. This was the stuff that was made, the LSD, which was made by Nick Sand and Nick Scully.
I've talked to at least 2 people who took that in the 60s, and they said it pretty much completely destroyed their reality and flattened them.
Absolutely. And I became friendly with Nick Sand later on in the early 2000s. And I said, it was stated in court that was actually LAD, which is another lysergic psychedelic, which wasn't illegal at the time. And he said, oh, no, that was just what we told the court. It was actually LSD, but it was a much higher dose than was usual. But we put 350 micrograms in every tablet, which is...
For comparison, how much would that be compared to the average tab of acid today?
The average tab of acid today is 70 or 80 micrograms, and this was 350. So it easily blew the modern stuff out of the water.
Yeah,
and
so that's like 4.5. That's like 4.5 tabs of.
Yeah,
and I'm guessing people were taking more than 1 tab of that also.
Absolutely true. And now, the essential thing to remember about this this brand of acid was that it was to be given away. He made thousands of doses, and they were all given away. And the message came through to us was that if we find that you've sold any of this, you're not getting any more. So I had this third of a tab of LSD and a teaspoon of cannabis tincture, and I settled down listen to Bach's Well-Tempered Clavier, a beautiful piece of music. But it seemed that when I closed my eyes, I saw a three-dimensional world, a different three dimensions than what we can normally see. And it was like this was at right angles to our normal perceptions. But in this three-dimensional vision that I had, there were crystal spheres suspended in space in a regular pattern, like they were atoms in a crystal, say. And each one reflected or refracted, rather, they refracted all the other crystals. And in fact, as I examined them more closely, they were only the refractions of the other crystals. They had no intrinsic existence of their own. And
very Buddhist.
Yeah, very Buddhist, very Buddhist. Now, I was captivated by this experience and entranced by it, and it made a permanent impression on me. However, it was a few months later, less than a year, when I came across the writings of Tu Shun, who founded the Chinese school of Buddhism called Huayan. And they in particular held the Avatamsaka Sutra in very high regard. And actually, I've got it here. I could read you the if I could find it. No, it's not in the contents, but Huayan described exactly the experience I had, and I realized that this was either the Huayan Buddhists had been doing psychedelics, or this was a valid meditation experience, which could, as I found out, be engineered by taking LSD and cannabis. I've tried several times since then to repeat the experience by taking an equivalent dose of both drugs, but it seems to be what Sasha Shogin would call a +4 experience, one that has a mystical impact but can't be repeated.
Interesting. So that seems like it definitely left an impression on you then.
Oh, absolutely, yes. I do have an index in here. Let's see if it's... Nope. It's not.
Okay. Interesting. So I feel like a lot of people... that's interesting that you bring that up, that you were trying to repeat it. I feel like a lot of people with psychedelic experiences or simply spiritual experiences that don't involve psychedelics, or may even be spontaneous, particularly early in life, spend a lot of effort trying to repeat them. And that's often one of the reasons why people, I think, get attracted to spiritual systems and traditions. But sometimes it seems that those things can't be repeated. And that's just maybe one of life's mysteries. I don't know if you have thoughts on that.
I think it may be repeatable, maybe it can't be repeated, but you should just let the experience go. If there are many experiences which one would like to repeat, but just simply aren't a repeatable experience. It's just it was just that evening, that situation I was in, that brought this up in my mind. I don't know what I would have to do to repeat it, but with all experiences, you should just let them be, let them. And also, there is another thing about significant experiences in the Tibetan Buddhist practice. It is permissible to tell your guru about the experience, but only once. You tell him once and that's it. Forget about it. It's the more you remember the experience and say, I felt this, I felt that, the less real it becomes, the more it becomes just a matter of words and not a matter of seeing.
It sounds like people might have just been, that's, you know, that's very wise, as people may have just been getting sick of hearing people's trip stories over and over again.
Yes, very much so. Yes.
Yeah. That's very funny. So one perennial question that I think people have is, can these type of psychedelic experiences be repeatable or different word, accessible without psychedelics? Because obviously when you combine psychedelics and spiritual practices, you get into some amazing places, but then, you know, later on, perhaps the thought arises, can this be repeatable through other methods? And hence the potentially, you know, the practice of yoga and meditation, or esoteric yoga even. And I'm curious your thoughts on that. Like, is it possible, and it sounds like possibly this is the case, is it possible that these experiences are just simply not accessible without substances?
I've wondered about that, and I think they possibly are accessible, but you need to be able to train your brain in such a way that they are accessible. I think that several of the Tibetan practices are merely ways of training your brain to respond in the correct manner.
That's interesting. I mean, when you think about yogis in Tibet or in India who meditate for 7 years unceasingly, and maybe modifying their physiology in certain ways as well, you know, that's always the question of what's happening in their brains. Right.
And I've actually met yogins who have spent 21 years in retreat. A yogin who went into retreat and came out after 7 years, and he learned that the Chinese had invaded Tibet and said, "Oh, I'm going back into retreat," and stayed another 7 years, came out and found the Chinese were still there, went back into retreat, and eventually when he emerged after that one and found the Chinese were still in Tibet, he said, "Oh, screw it, I'm going to Nepal." And that's how I met him.
Okay. Well, that raises another question, which is, you know, obviously so many of the so many Tibetan practitioners did go to Nepal or India or the US or Canada or Australia or other places. How it seems to me as an outsider that there's actually a lot of money behind preserving the Tibetan traditions and publishing, and publishers like Shambhala and things like this. But my question is, how much of the tradition is in danger of just being lost permanently because of the Chinese occupation?
I think that there's quite a lot of the tradition which has been preserved. The practice of taking drugs has always been a secret practice in Tibet. In fact, if we look at other drug-taking traditions, we see that they've spilled the beans quite freely. But in Tibet, they managed to keep their lips sealed. If we look at Japan, for instance, in the 9th century, there was a scroll created called the Chojo Mandara scroll. And Mandara in Japanese is actually mandala in Sanskrit. It's just their attempt at writing mandala. Unfortunately, they have a problem with their L's. So in this Chojo Mandara scroll, there are several deities. They are drawn, their mantras are given, a written description is given of the deity, and also there are drawings of their Ayutthana versions. Ayutthana is a Sanskrit word which means the secret appearance of the deity. And there is a deity there in the Chojo Mandara scroll. There are dozens. I'll choose this one as a particularly good example. He is holding, he is one of the Ushnisha deities. There's a set of 8 Ushnisha deities. And he is holding a lotus in his left hand. On top of the lotus, it says in the text, and there is a parasol on top of the lotus. But what's there doesn't look like a parasol at all. We have to remember that the very word for mushroom was forbidden in ancient India. And
why is that? Why is that?
Oh, it was a religious prohibition. The Brahmins used mushrooms in their rituals, like it's described in the Rig Veda, but they don't actually describe what they're taking, what the Amrita or Soma or Shukra or whatever the word they used for it.
Was that a caste thing? Like they wanted to say that it was forbidden to other castes?
Yes. Well, more or less. Religion was forbidden to other castes.
Yeah, funny.
Religion was practiced only by Brahmins. And
religion, period.
I'm sorry?
Religious practices, period, were only for Brahmins. Wow.
Yes.
Yeah. That's
no one else practiced religion. If you wanted a religious ceremony done, then you hired a bunch of Brahmins to do it. And
when we're talking about religion, we mean kind of like Homa ceremonies and the big Indian style ceremonies. Presumably there were spiritual practices for non-Brahmins, of different types.
Nope. Not in the Aryans. No, in the indigenous Indians, yes, there were. But the 5 Aryan tribes invaded India about 2500 BC, and in their tribes, that they eventually amalgamated, and they created a language from their 5 languages. The new language was called Sanskrit, which means the perfected one. And Sanskrit was this wonderful new language they created, except it didn't have a word for mushroom. And only the Brahmins practice their religion at all, and they were hired by members of other castes, the kings, the warriors, the farmers, and so on. They were hired to do their religion, and they performed the Agnihotra, which is the fire ritual, at which they consumed soma. We can't definitively say what soma was, but I believe it's pretty obvious that it was a mushroom of some kind, and probably Amanita muscaria. The god who personified this Amanita muscaria mushroom, which is the red one with white spots, if anyone doesn't know. The god who personified that mushroom was Rudra. Now, the name of Rudra, it could mean the howler, or it could mean the weeper. So both of these effects, both of these can be seen as the effects of the Amanita muscaria.
Sure.
The weeper, because it actually makes you secrete more tears.
Oh, okay. I thought that was straightforward. People having emotional moments, but okay.
No, anybody. I've tried Amanita muscaria just once, and I was not impressed. But apparently, you're supposed to drink your urine, and I didn't do that. But I had tears running down my face with no emotional content. It was merely gushing tears. Now, after a little while of living in northwestern India, they came into contact with the indigenous people who had their own mushroom deity. And the indigenous mushroom deity was known as Shiva. And eventually, in the Vedic period, these two were equated. Shiva was probably Psilocybe cubensis. And the god adopted a lot of the earlier gods' attributes. And in fact, later we see the rise of Vajrayana Buddhism. And in particular, there's a very popular bodhisattva in Buddhism called Avalokiteshvara. And this is actually a borrowing of Shiva. Avalokiteshvara was originally Lokeshvara, who is a local form of Shiva. Now,
that's fascinating. I did not know that.
Oh, it's in a very expensive book, which is the 15-volume description of Buddhist deities by Lokesh Chandra, the great scholar of Buddhist iconography. Oh. And he points it out in there, and there's a few other things that are really remarkable that he points out. Now, Avalokiteshvara, in his 10-headed, six-armed form, you'll see that he wears a deer skin over his left shoulder, and he carries a vessel in one hand and a bow and arrow in another hand. These are all Rudra's attributes. They've been borrowed from the early Vedic the Rudra as depicted in the early Vedic period. The vase of liquid, or the pitcher of liquid, is especially interesting here, as in the 1890s, the Asiatic Society of Bengal actually worked out from linguistic roots. It was not intended to be anything at all about drugs. They actually deduced that the jalasa in the pitcher held by Rudra was actually urine.
Mm.
And so anyway, this was borrowed into Buddhism, just as many other Shiva forms of Shiva, that is, were borrowed into Buddhism under different names, many names, especially Vajra Bhairava, Isha, Ishana. There's a dozen common ones.
Well, just that comment that Avalokiteshvara was Lokeshvara fundamentally changes my perception of so many things profoundly. I'm very grateful for that teaching. That leaves me, I have to ask, what else is in that book that you can remember that is so profound on that level?
Oh, in the latest book or the earlier one, the
15 volume, you said there were some other things in there.
Yes, indeed. There are, like, for instance, Amitabha. It's generally parsed, the name Amitabha is generally parsed as meaning measureless light. Abha is radiance, mita is to measure, not. Immeasurable radiance. However, Professor Lokesh Chandra says, no, that's not really where it comes from. It comes not from Sanskrit, but from Prakrit. And in Prakrit, it means it directly refers to the substance, and it says that it's the immeasurable substance that was used in rituals like the Amrita. What else is in there? Oh. Well, there are a few other clues about the various drugs that we used, but I don't have the 15 volumes right in front of me. They're actually
okay. You guys wondering if you remembered anything?
They're on the phone, but they're locked away in storage.
I see. Interesting. Oh, thank you. Yeah, that's I'm gonna have to think about that. That's a lot, and that's very satisfying for me to hear a bit about Lokeshvara. Thank you. So one thing I wanted to ask is. Yes.
I should mention. I've just remembered another. It's another form of Avalokiteshvara, but he is in his one-faced, two arms form, and he's shown with his left hand in the dhyana mudra, the meditation mudra, and his right hand is on his right knee. And we would think nothing to see that that deity. It's that's just another form of Avalokiteshvara. But if you read the sadhana, which describes him sitting like that, it says that Amrita pours from his fingertips. So there's another direct connection of Avalokiteshvara with Amrita.
Fascinating. one thing I maybe want to look at this through the flip side, which is we're talking about the use of psychedelics in essentially controlled environments in finely graded societies with levels and secrets and practices and long preparation. And that is, of course, profound set and setting, and also completely diametrically opposed to how psychedelics are usually taken now. And one thing that I was thinking about when you were talking about Brahmins gatekeeping psychedelics and keeping it to themselves, hoarding it, is how different that is from now, when psychedelics are, well, less so now, but generally psychedelics have been seen as an outsider pursuit. But now, obviously, psychedelics, particularly now, are so popular and so many people are taking them with no set and setting or ritual context or preparation or spiritual initiation or anything like that. Mm-hmm. And obviously that's been the case since the 60s. What is your take on that spiritually? Do you think that that's a positive thing, or what are your thoughts on it?
I think that psychedelics shouldn't be available to everyone, but now that the cat is out of the bag, it's best to come clean and tell the entire story about how psychedelics were used in Tibet. And basically, my book, Psychedelic Buddhism, gives several ways in which psychedelics can be used to enhance your meditation or your experience of Buddhism. I'm not very prescriptive in my descriptions of what practices to do. It's in the book, I have left it to people generally to gauge how much of the ritual they want to enact, and how much of the psychedelics they want to merge with their rituals.
The rituals in your book, do you need to be an initiated Buddhist to do them, or it sounds like you can just go straight to it?
Yes, absolutely. So the rituals are, like, for instance, the basically internal ritual of the 4 Brahma Viharas, which is the 4 divine abodes. And these are love, compassion, sympathetic joy, and equanimity. And this is something which has been perpetuated by Buddhism. But the Buddha said he didn't come up with this himself. He learned it from a teacher in the forest where he went to meditate after leaving the palace. And he learned it from a gentleman called Alama Kalama, which is a ridiculous name. It means vowels and consonants, that's basically what they mean. So he's... I don't know why he was called vowels and consonants, but that was Alama Kalama is his name, and that's who taught the Buddha the 4 Brahma Viharas.
Interesting. Well, maybe we should start to draw to a close then. But I want to. This has been a fascinating and awesome talk. I wanted to ask, maybe, if people want to start to kind of go explore this side of things, whether or not it involves Buddhism, but certainly the combination of psychedelics with ritual. I want to ask you how you think people should start to go about that, and also critically, what people should not do.
One thing they shouldn't do is take psychedelics after they've been drinking alcohol. I think a little sip of alcohol is fine, but don't get drunk and then take out psychedelics. it's very much up to the reader how much they want to take on. I actually give various meditations followed with various aspects of Buddhist culture. Although these are, like all things in Buddhism, they're not to be held as inviolate. They're not to be hung on to like this is what is real and the rest is made of papier-mâché or something. This is the whole world right here, right now is what is real, and we should behave with a reverence to what is around us, and I think we should preserve these experiences, psychedelic experiences, for maybe once or twice a year.
Okay.
Take you a while to absorb the lessons that the psychedelics have taught you. And it is sometimes a matter of months before the actual lessons become part of your life. And so I would say keep the psychedelic experiences fairly infrequent, and to use the practices I've got in this book to help you investigate them and to sit with the experiences while you're having them.
Wonderful. That sounds like good advice. I think most people that I know that persist in doing psychedelics for longer than a few years tend to seem to come to that 1 or 2 times a year thing.
Right.
So we should wrap up. My dog is demanding that I walk him, and he will not be denied. But please tell us about where people can find out more about you and your 2 books, or any other books or anything else you want to mention.
My first book is called Secret Drugs of Buddhism. This one is called Psychedelic Buddhism. And I do have a website. It's been mangled by the ISP, the Internet Service Provider I'm using. So it's very difficult for people to get in at the moment. But it's called Amrita Dzong, AMRITA DZONG, and that's what my own teacher calls his organization in Great Britain, and this is just an offshoot of that.
Excellent. All right. Well, thank you very much for having that conversation. That was wonderful, and I definitely learned a lot. And I hope people check out your books after they hear this.
Oh, I hope so too.
All right. All right. Well, thank you again for talking.
It's been fun.
Okay. Talk to you later.
Bye now.
All right. Hope you really, really enjoyed that. I definitely had a lot of fun in that conversation. Meet us at magick.me, magick.me, my school for magic, meditation, and mysticism, where you can learn all the skills you need to unleash your true self. I will see you in class, and until next time, hang in there.